The recording has now begun and everyone should be in.
We'll just give a minute here to get everybody connected. Okay, so welcome everyone to this month's Quest session. Just a couple of housekeeping items to start. So though we're meeting virtually today, I'm a part of UNB, and UNB stands on the unsurrendered and unceded traditional Wolastoqey land, as established in a series of peace and friendship treaties. So as a reminder, this session is being recorded. We'll wait till the end of the presentation to provide an opportunity for people to ask questions. You'll be able to do that by raising your hand, or you can put a question in the chat as well. But feel free to put any questions you have in the chat while the presentation is ongoing, and we'll address those at the end also. If you'd like to be added to our mailing list, if you're not already, Kelsey will add the email into the chat now. So just send a message to that email and you'll be kept up to date on Quest events. So today's session is focused on institutional methodological reviews for qualitative research. And to talk about that is Dr. Natasha Hanson. So Dr. Hanson, whose pronouns are she, they, is a qualitative methodologist and research manager with Horizon Health Network. Dr. Hanson will be sharing a bit more about her role during today's presentation. So we're excited to have you and to hear what you have to share. One more small note. So during the presentation, we're just going to keep everybody on mute just to make sure we can hear everything clearly. Without further delay, I will turn it over to you, Dr. Hanson.
Great, thanks very much. And I will attempt to share my slides. And can everybody see that? Or somebody let me know.
It's good.
Okay, good. Awesome. Okay, thanks everybody for joining us today. So as Rachel mentioned, I'm a qualitative methodologist with research services at Horizon Health Network. And I also act as a reviewer for our human research protection program. And so it is that sort of role that I'll be digging into today in terms of, some advice and discussion about those reviews. So I have sort of a brief overview of what the HRPP is and how it's set up, and then some of the common issues that sort of people run into within reviews. So hopefully giving some good advice on putting sort of protocols together in terms of resolving some of those issues. And then hopefully discussion with you about your own best practices in terms of what you include in protocols, and yeah, hopefully to learn from one another. Okay, so the Human Research Protection Program is an institution-wide review and education process for research conducted at Horizon Health Network. And really it's to ensure the protection of research participant rights. It's accredited, so that means that there's standard operating procedures that we follow, and that it's really about conforming to those rigorous standards and using evidence-based best practices. And I will just say that the HRPP content, which is lovely, I have totally stolen from my colleague, Bryn Robinson, Dr. Bryn Robinson, who wrote it, and it's on Horizon Health Network's website. So you can feel free to also check that out. And she put together this lovely graphic about the mandate of the HRPP, which in essence, as you can see, it's safeguarding human research participants and ensuring that their rights their rights, safety, and well-being are protected. It's also is about providing guidance and support to the research community and assistance in terms of complying with relevant regulations and providing timely and high quality review and oversight of those projects, and trying to promote a culture of research excellence, which I'm sure everyone on the call today also is trying to achieve. So in essence, there's two components of the HRPP review. One is compliance and methodology review. So, that would include evidence of authorization from appropriate regulatory authority, if that's applicable, evidence of support from impacted departments, compliance with all the different regulations, including privacy, which is obviously a big one in consideration for health research, and methodology review, which is what we'll get into today. And then the second piece, so once that these two initial pieces are approved, then it moves to the Horizon Research Ethics Board review. And this is through the online Romeo system. There's links in the website for those of you who haven't applied through that system. It's available there. So in terms of the HRPP Qualitative Methodological Review, this is just an overview. It's not necessarily absolutely everything, so please don't take this as, including all of the little details that one might look for, but I think that it's giving an idea of what the overview review would look like. In terms of, and I think we're all sort of aware of these pieces in general, right? What should be included in a protocol, relevant background literature. If it's a qualitative project, then it should include also the relevant qualitative literature as well. Study design, which obviously is really important. So, the theoretical framework that you might be working with, and or methodological approach, right? Is this a grounded theory study? Is it a case study? Is it a phenomenological study? The objective of the study, participant selection. So what does sampling look like? What's your method of approach, which is actually really critical within health research? Is it through community where people can essentially sort of apply themselves to be part of the research, or are you going through somebody within the circle of care? Sample size, always a hot button issue. And the setting of data collection as well. Is this in person? Is it virtual? What platform are you using if it's virtual? Is it over the telephone? Could be a lot of different things, could be a combination. Data collection, interview guides would need to be included. Type of recording, where are those being secured? Field notes, are they being taken? In what manner? Data saturation, again, a contentious sort of thing, but realistically, what is being looked for there is the mention of saturation, right? Whether you're using data saturation, if so, who are you citing? Because as we know, there's lots of different ways to go about that. If you're not using that principle, then, what's your discussion of choice of sort of sample size and rationale? Participant checking, are you doing it, etc.? Who's collecting the data? are there pre-existing relationships with participants? Data analysis. So, what is your data analysis plan? Which I don't think I actually have there. So I'm sorry. How many people are coding the data? What sort of method of analysis are you using? Who are those people? Are you using software? And again, participant checking, because as we know, it could be in the data collection part of the project, but it could also be, post and initial analysis. So that's just sort of an overview, things that, we're looking at essentially. And then we get into some of the sort of issues that come up and where you might be asked for clarification by the HRPP about your project. So these have come up. So this is sort of real world. And again, the data is thanks to Dr. Bryn Robinson. And so I'll just discuss some of these because I think, and I'm going to just say that, as a researcher myself, right, with my other hat as somebody who does research, obviously I don't review my own research projects. And I have absolutely been asked for clarification on projects because, we're all human and review is good. It's nice to have somebody look at it and then come back with some clarification needed that, makes you think through, right, I missed that, I should put that in. So just to be clear that I'm not sort of coming at this as though things should be perfect the first time through. I think we can all learn to sort of think through our protocols and the different potential sort of issues that come up within them and making clarifications about them. So one of the common issues is that, protocols don't state what qualitative approach or analysis is being used, right? They just say they're doing qualitative research. Well, that's not good enough, frankly. You need to state an approach and type of analysis and cite the literature that you're using, because as we know, qualitative research is vast. There's a lot of different approaches, and, you need to be able to clarify what it is exactly that you're doing, right? In order to sort of have a handle on, is this a well thought out project? Is it a feasible project? Is it going to be sort of successfully completed? So I think also one of the really common pieces that comes up is not citing what type of thematic analysis that you're going to use as well. And I think, this has sort of changed over time, but there are different approaches to thematic analysis. And I think that clarifying which one that you're going to be using in terms of citing somebody, right, also indicates that, that's the process that you're going to use, which I think adds rigor to your protocol, essentially. Another one that's come up a couple of times is using hypotheses in qualitative research, which, is not really a best practice because in general, qualitative research isn't used to, test hypotheses. So you would have to have a rationale in order to sort of have that a hypothesis there, I would think. So I think this leads to sort of a comment that, sometimes it's more about explaining what it is that you want to do versus cut and dried, sort of this is acceptable, this is not. You know, there are instances of that, obviously. You know, not stating what your approach or analysis plan is just not acceptable. If you're going to use a hypothesis, then put in the rationale for it. You know, it's not, some of this is more about explaining further what is happening in terms of your design. Sort of unclear proposed use of measures or / data. So I think that, you know, the use of information collected from participants really needs to be tied to the research objective and accounted for within the analysis, right? Like, why are you collecting particular information from people? Now, that being said, this has come up most often when it's outside of, it's not, you know, necessarily a particular question, say within the interview guide. Although that could be the case, I guess, if it was a question that was totally unrelated to the topic or objective that was stated in the protocol, one might say, you know, why are you including that? But often it might be that, say in a mixed method project, you know, you're collecting a measure of some sort, or you're collecting some type of contextual information that does not appear to be linked to the objective of the study. And again, it goes back to rationale. Why are you collecting that? What are you going to do with it? You know, I do recognize, and I think, you know, most people recognize now that, you know, collecting demographic information within your qualitative research project is a good practice, right? In order to describe the group that your participants, right? But I think that if you go outside of that, then, you know, there should be some stated rationale there. Particularly if you don't then say in your analysis that you're going to use that to describe your participant group. Some further common issues. Now, the issues with sample size, which I will say, you know, there's a lot of debate in qualitative research about sample size. So, you know, this could just be reflecting that. But in general, within health research, you know, stating an approximate sample size is really going to be necessary. And then giving a rationale for that. Now, that could be, you know, if you're using saturation, citing the source of sort of, you know, how you're looking at saturation and what you're going to be thinking about in terms of using that, you know, and writing that in about sort of your thoughts on saturation, how you're going to be going about sort of endeavoring to find out when you've reached saturation. If you're not using saturation, you know, that's okay. You could give a different rationale for your sample size. There are debates about the use of saturation within qualitative research. And so, again, it's much more about explanation versus, you know, us taking a side in the debate about saturation. So more information is better, essentially, right? And then sometimes you'll find that it's not stated who's doing the interviews, right? Which sort of comes down to, again, you know, which I had mentioned sort of before, you know, are there some people on the research team that might have relationships with participants? Like, is it, you know, a clinician who they might be sort of linked to particular patients through care or something like that? You know, being reflexive about that, right? Which we talk about in qualitative research, you know, is good, right? Really being upfront about that, and then stating who it is then is going to be collecting, you know, the data. In these cases, it was particular to interviews, but, you know, stating who's going to be collecting the data. even if you don't necessarily, maybe it's a group within sort of the research team, but those people who aren't clinically linked to patients, you could just state that, right? So it doesn't necessarily have to hinge on stating an absolute individual, but maybe people within particular roles within the research team, and just ensuring that that level of detail is there. I think, again, sort of missing details on location of data collection, right? So as I had mentioned before, where is this happening? Are you going into a particular location to meet up with patients or participants? Are you doing this all virtually? I think, again, giving more information is better. Also, it could be a variety. Maybe you're not sure, but you're recruiting from several different ways. And so then you would just state several different locations where this might be happening. And then missing details regarding participant checking of qualitative data. So sometimes what will happen is, or as it used to be called, I feel like, member checking. Sometimes people will say that they're going to do participant checking in research, but then that's it. It's just a statement, but that doesn't really indicate what you're doing. Are you going to, have you asked whether they want results and you're going to be giving them the results back? How are you getting those results to them? Are you emailing them because they provided that, or they're providing an email or mailing address? If you're returning transcripts, again, how is that happening? What's your process then for feedback? So you get feedback from that, what then? So just details about the process that you're going to follow there. Participant checking is a great thing to do. It's just sort of, again, just giving further information about, the logistics behind that, and also then how you're going to sort of incorporate it, right? That information received. And then in terms of analysis, I think it's kind of common to have a really unclear description of coding. And again, I think the details matter. So, you're citing what kind of analysis you're doing, you're giving a description of that. You're, stating whether it's a single member of the team that's going to be taking that on. Are you going to have multiple coders? If you have multiple coders, how are you coming together for consensus on that? Or are you using consensus? What's the method in which you bring together those multiple coders for, the chosen analysis? I think describing that in general, in some level of particularity is necessary, right? In order to just have a clear plan of how that's going to come together. Often people might leave out sort of how participant groups of interview data will be combined or analyzed separately, right? If you're gathering data on different participant groups, I think, again, a clear analysis plan will state whether or not, are you going to look at them as a group initially? Are you combining everybody? What's your rationale if you do combine everybody? Are you going to then compare them? There's a lot of different approaches that could be taken. I think clarity and thinking that through really shows that you have a logical plan in place. And then one that comes up is in terms of note-taking. Sometimes note-taking is mentioned, but then that's it. It's not, sort of detailed as to one, What are you doing with those notes? How are you securing that data? Are you using the notes in the analysis, right? Are you using them to just double check your transcripts, right? Like how are you using them within sort of your analysis plan, which I think, is sort of critical. Otherwise, why are you collecting them if you're not going to use them? So I think, again, just giving the rationale for like their use, I think, is really helpful. So now, some of this overview, not the particular issues, but the overview that I give really came from, pieces of it came from COREC, which is the consolidated criteria for reporting qualitative research, which obviously has other things in it as well. But I mean, it is a helpful overview of sort of, what to include. And it is interesting because several journals now, look to this. And so using that sort of list initially to at least consider those different pieces of information, I think is kind of helpful. I mean, I say that as, a researcher who, had to apply COREC to a project where I didn't apply it to the protocol and was like, oh, I wish I'd had that information initially, frankly. Yeah. So I'm going to, maybe just open it up. What are other resources that people use? Do you have questions about what I've presented? It's a really sort of short snapshot, but maybe we could discuss further other people's best practices.
Again, if anybody wants to go ahead.
Thank you so much, Dr. Hanson, for your presentation. I have a quick question. So you, in qualitative research, you mentioned, I guess, the importance of mentioning the data sample. How do you measure when you have enough of a sample for the study? Because in quantitative studies is different. We can use power analysis, but how does that work for qualitative?
Right. And so that's why I brought up saturation. So saturation is the idea. Now, you can look that up because there's like a whole literature and different ways that people have sort of conceptualized that and applied it. This sort of really simplistic idea of saturation is that, you've reached enough people to sort of feel that your analysis is solidly sort of representing the group that you're studying. So there's a number of different ways that people apply it. I think in a lot of my training, it came from sort of the idea that if you were doing thematic analysis, you came to a point where there weren't new ideas being introduced into in your coding, right? You reached a point where there was a level of agreement. There's been a lot of pushback against saturation, though, because it is, and there has been sort of a quantification of saturation as well, which I think is really troubling. Again, this is my researcher hat. So if you wanted to quantify saturation and you cited that, then, go forth. That's fine. And that's, individual sort of researcher preference, because that's a stated way that one can do it, right? So I think, though, if you're interested sort of in looking into that further, I would read up on saturation and the pros and cons of that. It is not applicable to some kinds of research approaches, though. If you're doing case studies, qualitative case studies, that's not what you're looking for, because that's about in-depth description, right? So it's really kind of dependent and matches up with what approach you're using, I think. Yeah.
Thank you.
Okay, I hope that was helpful.
Yes, thank you. Thank you for simplifying it.
No problem. Anybody else?
You can raise your hand or just add a question to the chat. Sarah.
Thanks so much. Thanks, Natasha. Regarding your question about the other resources that you use, and the COREG. So one resource that I use that you probably know of too is that Equator Network for reporting guidelines, and they have every possible study that you can use, and there's a guideline for everything. And I think the journals are referring to that more. But my question is, for qualitative research, what's the difference between the COREG guidelines and the SRQR, the Standards for Reporting Qualitative Research Guidelines?
I don't know, to be totally honest. I just know that, there are these different sort of standards out there. They do tend to have a lot of the same information, right? I think you would have to compare them to see what the difference would be.
Okay. Have you compared them, or do you just prefer the COREG?
It's just one of the ones that I've been using recently. I've got to be honest. Yeah. I think the other one that you mentioned, I have seen them and I have reviewed them, but I don't have it sort of at top of mind what the differences would be. And honestly, from what I remember, most of them have the same pieces, right?
Okay. Yeah. Okay, thanks. Yeah, the only thing I noticed is it looks like that SRQR one was updated like just last month, or maybe more recently, but I don't know, but maybe.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah, and I wouldn't necessarily so I think thinking about sort of the general topics, particularly sort of when writing the protocol, would be more so sort of what I was getting at there. Although if you know that you want to publish in certain kind of publications, then, checking out what, checklists or standards they're using for reporting is a good idea, right? So that you have that information beforehand as you put the project together.
Okay, great, thanks.
No problem. Anybody else?
Sarah, again, did you have a question?
Oh, who, me? Oh,
sorry. I thought your hand was with mine.
No, I thought I just lowered it, but.
Perfect. So I do have a question while we're here. One thing that I've always been interested in is the way that qualitative research designs evolve over time. And as we've seen with COVID, so unanticipated events, or even the development of new technology, and how that kind of further, kind of speeds up the evolution of these designs. And like, how is that handled by, like, for example, the HRPP, where somebody submits something with a new, perhaps, where the methodology or the methods are using are, a bit in a gray area, or kind of like an uncharted territory. How is that handled by the HRPP?
Right. I think that, again, it comes back to giving more information, right? And a lot of the concerns would be more so, especially if we think about sort of, COVID and those sort of things, was more around the privacy considerations. Like if you were doing virtual, focus groups or something like that, right? Whereas the methodological concerns, some of them might just be sort of, again, in sort of fully explaining, right? How you're going to go about doing that. What does it look like? Who's running them? I think there's also been interesting sort of research that uses social media as well, right? And again, I think it comes back to sort of explaining how you're doing it, how you're collecting the data, where is it being stored, Yeah, I don't think, again, it doesn't come back to sort of like my personal preference and whether I would do that, right? It's more about, is it fully explained? Does it make sense in relation to the project? And, you know, have you taken into account sort of any of those sort of more broader considerations, right? I don't do the regulatory review, right? But you know, you can always sort of think through that piece too in terms of what your methods mean in regards to that.
Right, that makes sense.
Yeah, but that's a good question. I think that research is ever changing. So yeah, I think just fully explaining what it is you're doing.
Thank you.
Yeah, absolutely. Anybody else?
Or any experiences that are related, you know, in your own lives, your own work that anybody wants to share? In the chat, nothing.
It's a quiet group.
Natasha, I have a question for you. Yeah, thank you very much for the presentation. I know you're not going to solve this today, but I'll throw it out there because one of the challenges that I have found in the past is, you know, when submitting for approvals, we still tend to fall closer to more the quantitative lens. Like, so for example, you talked about saturation, and with ethics reviews, you know, with the qualitative study, sometimes you keep recruiting till you know, feel like there is nothing more that you can potentially find on that topic. But, you know, there's processes that kind of force you into a box saying, well, how many people? So I'm just wondering if any of that has changed over the last little bit, and if there's a bit more flexibility when it comes to qualitative research, where we're taking off the quantitative lens and looking at it saying sometimes we don't know what we don't know, and you know, it could be a range versus trying to fit a round peg into a square hole, or vice versa.
Right. Yeah, and I think it's a good point. I think from my perspective, as long as you're putting an you can say approximately, right? Like, you know, I will say that, you know, I'm only a piece of that review, right? And so unfortunately, I can't solve sort of the other piece, but I will say that I think what is being asked for in general is an approximation. So if you overestimate, that's not an issue, right? And as you say, you could give a range and then state that you're looking for saturation within that. And I think that's totally appropriate, and I would go ahead and do it. Again, as long as you're explaining why it is you're giving a range, what that is, you know, how you're going to be looking for saturation within that, I think it's totally acceptable. I think what is not accepted is to give no approximation. So, you know, and you're right, that is with a quantitative lens, 100%. But unfortunately, I just don't think that's going to fly. But I do think that if you put a range with, you know, why it's a range and a citation of saturation or whatever other principle you might be using, I think it was certainly, it, you know, checks the methodological box for sure. And it has numbers there. So I suspect would be fine.
And as a follow-up, what is there a particular, again, it's always nice to kind of overestimate and then not need as many, because then that's okay, everyone's happy with that. Now, what happens if you estimate 20 and then you discover you need 30? Now, what's that number where you're going back for an amendment?
That's a little trickier. Agreed. Yeah, I think, you know, using the caveat of approximately, you know, essentially, what does that cover? I I'm not sure. I mean, I think if you're still trying to reach, like, again, if you stated that you were trying to reach saturation and you just didn't get it with 20, and you said approximately, then from my methodological point of view, then that's appropriate, right? And you state, and this is the other thing which I think I've seen and, taken note of myself, is that, and that you state that you'll continue until you reach saturation, right? I think that's sort of a critical piece to state as well.
Thank you.
No problem.
So we have one question in the chat from Walu. Walu asks, do you find that working through the different sections in the Romeo portal is usually generative enough as far as producing the kind of information required? Or do you find that the actual protocol submitted should be fitted to match COREG or some of the other standards mentioned?
Yeah, it's a good question. And I think, you'll find that the questions within Romeo are quite different to what you're going to need from a protocol point of view at times, right? So it's asking you for sort of an overview, but and then it's asking you to go in depth for some of the pieces like privacy and those sorts of things. But your protocol should be, use sort of that standard kind of protocol template and then hit those kind of points that I put in the overview, right? Your background literature, because you're not going to have background literature in any of the Romeo pieces. So it's quite a standalone document. And how I go about it as a researcher, and as within research teams, is we write we write our protocol very in depth. And then we take the pieces that we can and put it into the Romeo application, not vice versa. And that is how I would recommend going about it. And then filling in some of those details, within Romeo that might not be sort of in your protocol. It can be a good prompt actually to add some of the back into the protocol. But I would, process-wise, I would write a thorough protocol and then use that to answer the Romeo questions, if that's helpful. I think that, and hopefully it answers your question. And I think using sort of those guidelines, like CORAC, or, you could look at the ones that Sarah mentioned as well, are helpful to think through, right? They're really going to give you sort of an idea of what needs to be in there.
We got a great thanks. So I think you answered it.
Okay. Awesome.
Anybody else with anything? I don't see anything right now. So I want to thank you again, Dr. Hanson, for sharing your expertise and your experience with us. It's very helpful. So while I'm wrapping up, I'd just like to share the info for the next session. So March's session is still being confirmed, and you will receive a notice about that when that's done. But in the meantime, the April session will be on April 27th. UNB professor Dr. Rose McCluskey will present on simulation-based qualitative research. And you'll also get a notice for that. So again, you'll get the notices if you're signed up for the mailing list from the email address that Kelsey added at the beginning. So again, thank you, Dr. Hanson, for preparing this presentation, and to everyone for attending today and for being a part of this community. If anyone has any questions or comments, feel free to email that address again. Otherwise, we look forward to seeing you again soon.
Great. Thanks very much.